Hey guys, Tisha here, and we are back for another Counting the Cost, chapter 3 read this time. I hope it's 3. Yeah, it's 3. Before I begin, let me first apologize if the video cuts off quickly. I'm just going to pick up wherever it left off. I do not know how much memory I have up here, and I have a feeling that this is going to be a long chapter. So hopefully we can make it work out. Thank you for watching. Like the video and subscribe and leave a comment down in the comment section. Let's begin. Chapter 3, Clipped Wings and Hills to Die On. Clipped Wings and Hills to Die On. What in the world kind of title is that? Okay, let's see. I sat up straight, checked my skirt once more, and prepared my brightest smile. Okay, so we left off with the whole accusations of Josh and them being upset that the church revealed it to some other people and then they were questioned by authorities. And now we're starting off with her preparing her brightest smile. So let's see where this goes. A quick glance left and right told me that Jonna, Jessa, and Ginger were all doing likewise. It was one of our first public appearances since the release of our book in March 2014 about our lives and our faith called Growing Up Duggar. Okay, so never mind. She's not going to talk about that. I've been kind of unsure about it at first, but it had been way easier than I thought. Pops had taken care of everything from the writer who helped us with words to dealing with the publisher. He'd even told us that since there was an advance, he'd been able to buy us some new gently used harps. Since there was an advance. So the money for the book that the girls wrote with the publisher obviously went to their father if he bought them gently used harps. Not they bought themselves that. So as always, her father is profiting from his family. Writing was unfamiliar, but talking was easy. So at this impromptu Q&A at a bookstore in North Carolina, we all knew what was expected of us. We knew the unwritten script that we needed to follow. How do you kids feel about the show? Do you like it? Oh, it's a family ministry, said Jonna. You know, sometimes it's hard, but the film crew is like a family to us. We love having them in our home. I added, wanting to wipe away any hint of negativity from my sister's answers. And how long do you think it's going to go? Well, I don't know about that, said Jessa, but I do know that we just feel like it's a window of opportunity that God has given our family. And we'd be happy if it was over tomorrow, said Ginger. We're just leaving it up to God. It was all true, but it was not the whole truth. Even in the early days, my feelings were not quite as simple as the script we were following. Below is a picture of the crew that filmed The Girls in the Big House. Season 1 had been a hit, so were seasons 2 and 3, which followed soon after, airing a total of 48 episodes throughout 2009. All that success meant that the rhythm of our lives were increasingly set by filming that was now taking place for 10 or 11 months of the year. The perks were still good. We got to travel more. Mom and Pops went to San Francisco for their 25th wedding anniversary, and a bunch of us flew down to El Salvador for a missions trip. But some of the best times were the simplest ones, like a road trip to DC or Branson, Missouri, and Silver Dollar City. We crowd into our old RV with the back window open and make a game of getting the semi-drivers to honk at us. We park in a Walmart parking spot to sleep at night, and then stock up on Little Debbie oatmeal cream pies, deli chicken tenders, and potato wedge fries as soon as the store opened in the next morning. So instead of going to an RV park where they could park their vehicle, go to the bathroom, take showers and all of that stuff, they parked at a Walmart, probably to not only have access to the store in the morning, but to conserve funds. I love these times when we were all together, especially when it was just the Duggars. The presence of the film crew brought plenty of good things, but I quickly grew to dislike the way they sometimes wanted to spring surprises on us. I guess it made for good TV to see us react in real time to the news of whatever challenge or adventure they set for us, even if it was just a simple escape room or a trip to a park. But it got to the point where I was feeling the stress nearly every time they were filming. Either I was trying to bury my discomfort and anxiety when they sprung a surprise on us, or fake my joy when we were filming something we'd already rehearsed. I had to keep my reality far away from TV. With the increasing success of the show, we also started attracting some negative attention. We had a family blog that people would use to contact us. And at first, Pops did all the sifting through emails, having warned us reading anything that came through it. It's interesting that they were receiving emails, that the father was, considering that these people didn't even have a television in their home. He also warned us about any negativity we might see online or hear about in other places, reminding us that people are going to say negative stuff. There would always be naysayers. There wasn't much access to the internet for us in those days, and there was a soft rule that we couldn't do social media until we were married. Not until they were adults, but until they were married. But while Pops could handle most of the emails, the amount of physical mail that people sent to our home was starting to pile up. Some of us girls began to help sort through it all and respond to people who were when possible. Most of the time, the mail was overwhelmingly positive and kind, but from time to time, we received something negative. It might be a letter with pockets of condoms inside and in all caps telling us, "Stop having kids, you're overpopulating the earth," or just plain old hate mail telling us we were horrible people. Our parents would always respond with the same advice. When you're doing what's right, you're always going to be persecuted. Don't ever forget that Jesus was persecuted and he never sinned once in his whole life. I took comfort from their words, despite the fact that I was hardwired to search for approval like a sunflower that scans the sky. These negative reactions didn't bother me too much. Instead of feeling crushed by them, I actually felt encouraged. All of my life, I've been taught that ministry comes with hardship, that following God inevitably involves suffering. So in some ways, this negative feedback was kind of a relief. Having been to El Salvador and seen the conditions that the indigenous Christians were experiencing down there, no electricity, no running water, a constant humid heat and no AC, and frequently hearing from missionaries in other places who lived in similar conditions, and some even worse, I was already starting to feel that the ministry that God had called us Duggars to was way less challenging than others. Seeing the hate mail as a light form of persecution for the sake of Christ somehow slightly eased my guilt. It made me feel a little bit better about things. I feel like the success of the show also changed the way that we were viewed by the leaders of the IBLP. We were still all way less polished than the other model families, but the fact that we were airing almost every week of the year made us appealing in other ways. Instead of educating and resourcing the existing followers of Mr. Gothard, we were introducing millions of people to the world of the IBLP. It didn't go unnoticed, and as well as us girls being invited to help out at camps or volunteer at the main offices, the leaders started asking Pops for his input on decisions as well. So because this man is having a platform now where he's reaching thousands or millions of people, now you're going to give him a say about certain decisions. Pops was happy to oblige. He would tell us kids about how he talked with Mr. Gothard on this matter or that, how he had recommended a certain person to speak at a conference. He seemed to enjoy this new position, but he wasn't only talking to Mr. Gothard or other leaders. Pops often offered encouragement to parents. Many times I'd heard him talking with couples about their children, offering them advice like, you need to train them to understand why they believe what they believe. Or the Bible says to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. We as parents are responsible to God for how we raise our kids. Pops was never shy about telling the truth, even when it hurt a little. Pops was aligned with the way IBLP saw the world. Those 7 basic principles that were the core of everything made sense to him and had shaped the way he and Mom brought us up. I find it interesting that he's being shaped more by the 7 principles of the IBLP than he is the word. Mr. Gothard's teaching determined what little music we could listen to, the cut of our clothing, and the length of our hair. Not the Bible, but the teachings of this man. We would be homeschooled and hardly ever allowed to spend time in the company of anyone who wasn't either our parent or older sibling, or on a rare occasions, a friend from church. There would never be any drinking, any dancing, or any or even any contraception once we were married. Children are a blessing from God was a fundamental statement that underpinned so much of what the IBLP taught, but so was the subject of authority, especially the authority of parents over their children. A portion of scripture that was frequently taught or referenced was, honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee and thou mayest live long on earth. Ephesians 6, 2-3. Honoring parents, even into adulthood, was such a big deal that even if your parents weren't Christian, it would be a sin to disobey them. I feel like there's a few things that they tend to do with scripture to benefit them. I do believe that children are a blessing, but I do not think any of us serve a God, higher being, whatever your beliefs is, that will want you to continue to populate, and as a result, you suffer as a family. So you're having all these children and you have to feed them potato casserole, or whatever they said that they had to eat in the first few chapters, because you didn't have the funds to provide them with more nutritious meals. Or you're having all these children and as a result you're doing harm to your body. Or you're having all these children and as a result they're not getting the type of time and attention that they would and focus had you not had so many. If you wanted to get married and they refused to give their blessing, IBLP teaching was on the side of the parents. There wasn't a lot of talk about hell or damnation, but fear was a powerful tool within the IBLP, TV, public school, and even contemporary Christian radio stations with their rock music. These were all threats constantly trying to drag us away from religious Christian living. Children needed to be protected from them all, and so there was a lot of talk about umbrellas of protection, one of the most significant planks of the IBLP teaching. If a child ever were to disobey their parents' instruction or act in a way that dishonored them, they would be placing themselves at risk. By disobeying their parents, they would be stepping out from under the umbrella of protection, and terrible things could happen. By turning themselves over to sin, God's judgment would be on them. In the world of IBLP, the parents' authority didn't end when their children turned 18 or even the day they were married. They still talked about Bible's teachings of leave and cleave and how couples should make decisions together, but it seemed like they didn't really believe it when it conflicted with the parental authority teaching. Why am I not surprised? It might change or look different, but parental authority never stopped, never weakened. Like all my siblings, I knew that I would always strive to honor and obey my parents, even when I was married and had kids of my own. Saying no, going against mom and pop's wishes, it wasn't something I could have ever imagined myself doing. Oh, I can imagine myself doing it. I love my parents, but I don't live with my parents. My parents don't pay my bills. I do. My parents don't take care of my son. I do. So if I feel the need to do something that they may not necessarily agree with, I'm going to do it. It wasn't something I could have imagined myself doing, especially since our beliefs aligned in most areas. Many times my parents had told us that one day we'd get married and do things a little differently than they had. That's okay, they said. And so I believe that when the time came, if my husband and I made some different decisions about things from the way I was raised, those decisions would be respected. However, even though I couldn't see it at the time, IBLP also encouraged parents to clip their children's wings. Okay, so that's where we're getting the title from. They taught that children shouldn't stay with their parents until marriage. Children should stay with their parents until marriage, and that instead of going away to college, children should stay home and pick up other safer trades for work. In other words, don't better yourself and be a better person. What I want you to do is I want you to pick up a trade where you work for me, and in some form of way, as your parent, you're my child, but I'm also the person who helped you get this job. You're indebted to me, which means you still are required to have certain conversations and discussions with me. Interesting. That's not what it says. That's just my gathering. They encourage fathers to be self-employed, to build up family businesses, and have their boys work for them. It was a clear way of keeping full-grown adult offspring locked into the role of dependent children, just what I just said. Back then, seen through the eyes of my younger self, it seemed like a great plan. I didn't have any intention of leaving home or trying to make a life for myself on my own. Why would I? The world was dangerous and full of peril. At home in the big house where my parents could protect me, things were safe. But no matter how much Pops tried to keep our wings clipped or how badly he tried to keep us huddled in close underneath his own personal umbrella of protection. There was one child he couldn't prevent from making mistakes. Okay, are we gonna finally talk about it here? Are we? What y'all think? Put it down below. It was Josh. A few years after he was first sent away, he was in trouble again. He'd been caught looking at pornography on a phone of somebody he'd been working with. Those 7 basic principles didn't have much to say about secular therapy or rehab. So once more, Josh packed his bags and Pop sent him away from home for several months to do some demanding manual labor in the company of good Christian folk and get himself back on track. Okay, if he did this the first time, when he did whatever he did with his siblings and you sent him away, and now he's still doing things that they feel are sexually perversive, then why would you not get him some form of therapy? Now, him looking at porn is not nearly as bad as what he was doing to his female siblings, but this is something that they still don't agree with. So get the boy help, because manual labor isn't working. And just like before, we didn't talk about it much. Why am I not surprised? Josh's problems were only ever talked about vaguely, if at all, but Pops was happy to answer most all questions we had about the show, unless those questions were about money. He would explain the daily responsibilities, the upcoming events, and often encourage us by sharing positive feedback he'd had from people. It left me feeling in no doubt that the show was being used by God to minister to the nations. Pops would say yes to almost any positive feeling opportunity that came along. And we even ended up with crews from all over the world coming to our town to film with us for their own specials. I remember one time when a crew from South Korea came, they were kind but set a much more punishing schedule than we were accustomed to, filming 5 days in a row from 7 in the morning until 10, and sometimes even 11 at night. I don't remember so much about the Russians, other than that they were more laid back and spent time explaining to us how their previous plan to fix their declining birth rate was to give people refrigerators in return for having babies. So, we want you to have more babies. And instead of making sure that you have health care, instead of making sure that you have better paying jobs, and instead of making sure that things are in place so that you can have a successful household with multiple children, we're just going to give you a fridge. Here you go. That sounds ridiculous. With every season of the show that went out on TLC and every one-off program that Pop signed us up for, I could see him grow. He had sold his old used car lot and the vehicle towing service back when he entered politics, but had kept his car dealer's license up to date and still loved going to car auctions. He rented some land to Josh that he used as a car lot, and sometimes Pops would put some of his own vehicles on Josh's lot to sell. As the shows grew, Pops got more into buying real estate and focusing on maintaining what he had. But whenever he was talking about the show and the ministry impact he thought it was having, he really came alive. I've always had this great desire to reach people for Christ, he said, one day not long after he returned from a trip to New York City, where he, Mom, Jessa, Ginger, and Jordan, the newborn 18th Duggar, had appeared on The View. When we were flying in over the city, I was asking myself, how could we reach this many people for not the Lord? And then it occurred to me that there are so many people watching the show, we're reaching millions. I never would have dreamt that God would allow our family to have this influence over all these people. I shared his amazement that we had ended up in this position. It was wild and crazy that a family like ours from Northwest Arkansas, I said it right, you see me, Lisa? Y'all, I've been pronouncing it wrong, and I felt like I was saying it wrong. I now know that the S in the end is silent. Thank you, Lisa, for the clarification. I really do appreciate it. Should end up like just 5 years after this first documentary. And it was even more wild and crazy that we done nothing at all to make it happen in the first place. The only possible explanation was that God had opened doors for us. He had made a way. This show being a filming family, this was his calling on our lives, for now at least. The NYC story became one of Pops' favorites. I heard him tell it often, especially when it seemed like he wanted to help someone understand that we really weren't in it for the perks of fame or anything like that. Or he needed to explain that the show came to us and that we didn't go looking for it. Ever the salesman, Pops always seemed to know how to pitch it right, and his story always worked. At least it appeared to work, until the one time it didn't. I heard about it weeks later. A young man who was a family friend had apparently been talking with Pops one day at the big house. Pops had been trying to persuade the guy to agree to being in some filming, talking about the ways he believed that God was using the show to impact so many people, inferring that the numbers reached by our show on television had a greater impact than lots of other ministries. Thinking about how many people we are able to reach through the show, Pops had continued. Oftentimes, we are reaching people who would often never step foot into a church, yet they invite us into their living rooms each week. It's such a huge opportunity God put in our laps, and we should be good stewards of what He has given us. That's very interesting, Mr. Duggar, the guy said, choosing his words carefully. But Jesus, He talked to people on one-on-one too. I think that that's still vitally important today. Apparently, Pops was frustrated by the pushback, so he tried a different angle and a new analogy. Just picture yourself in a stadium and someone gives you a microphone. He let his words hanging in the air for just a moment longer than necessary, as if the idea was so big and so magnificent that if it needed extra time to compute. You can speak to everyone in the stadium and tell them about the Lord. You take that opportunity in a heartbeat, wouldn't you? I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? The guy shifted awkwardly, wondering whether speaking the truth to the power was worth it. He chose truth. I don't know, Mr. Duggar, sir. Not if God had told me to go and talk to the person under the bleachers. If I knew that the Lord wanted me to go talk to the one instead of the thousands, then I'd have to obey. And the crazy thing is, that's what Jesus did. Jesus wasn't concerned about the multitude of people. There were many instances where He was concerned about the one. So here you are trying to convince this man who apparently is in His word. Pops froze. He looked like he just swallowed a fish bone. He said when he recovered himself, shaking his head. No way, God would never tell you to do that. When I heard the story, I was kind of stunned. Was Pops really saying that he believed it was always God's desire for people to be involved in whichever ministry reached more people? And was he telling our friend that he knew God's will for this guy's life and that included filming? Was he really saying that to trust God's timing, we have to be able to receive the results in our lifetime? This was contrary to what Pops had always taught us kids. We've grown up with him reminding us little is much when God is in it. And we don't always see how God is working. Yet Pop's words went directly against times in the Bible where Jesus broke away from large crowds to address or minister to one person. It left me feeling confused and kind of sad. Long before our family friend had questioned Pops like that, I had almost concluded that life would be easier if I just avoided the whole relationship thing for as long as I could. Like a lot of families within the IBLP world, there were plenty of rules, though we didn't like to call them that. My parents preferred us to call them standards, convictions, or guidelines, and growing expectations about how us Duggar children would find marriage partner. Instead of dating, we talked about courtship, which was way more serious than simply playing around and having fun with people. We were only going to court someone we saw as a potential marriage partner, and we would always be chaperoned until the day we were married. We wouldn't kiss or even spend time alone in each other's company until we were married, and we wouldn't say I love you until we were officially courting, and we wouldn't hold hands until we were engaged. Only a guy could ask a girl to start courting, though, if Pops felt like he wanted to encourage what he thought of as a good possible match, not mom, between a guy and one of his daughters. It was okay for him to make hints and suggest we get to know each other. So the mother's opinion doesn't matter in this manner, just her father's. Josh had navigated it all and gotten married when he was 20, and I'd hoped it wouldn't have been too long before my Prince Charming would come along. But I knew I shouldn't let marriage constantly consume my thoughts. I also knew my parents loved me and wanted what was best for me, so it wasn't like Mom or Pops were ever going to actually arrange our marriages and force us to marry someone. But without our parents' blessing, there was simply no way that any relationship would ever be able to begin. Years and years of IBLP teaching had taught us that no good Christian child should consider going against our parents' wishes. Number one on the list requirements in a future spouse was that we had to have approval from our parents. Without that, it was game over before things even begun. We were encouraged not to just sit around waiting for our future mate to show up, but instead to occupy our time in ways that distracted us from constant thoughts of marriage. Mr. Gothard even taught that it was best to make a vow of single service, committing a specific number of years to serving God while single. That man controls so much of these people's lives. His teaching was compelling, but I preferred to commit to serve God, my family, and others until God brought my future husband along. I dressed conservatively, but inside I was a normal girl interested in romance and love like everyone else. I had desires and emotions, but I tried to keep them checked in and kept myself clear of the sin of talking about guys with my sisters. When we were younger, we were all encouraged to talk to our parents if we liked someone, asking them to help pray with us on it. Okay, so I'm gonna pause. There's two pictures here. The first one I'm gonna show you is Joy, Ginger, Jessa, Jill, and Jana. The next one is the Duggar sisters filming a photo shoot. So that's the first picture. And then that is, I can't even see, I hope y'all can see it clearly the second. I was okay with waiting. As the show kept on rolling from one season to the next, my life was increasingly full. Not only did I have 3 young buddies to look after, Joy, James, and Jenny, but I was also training to be a midwife. Between filming, studying, attending births, making sure that the 3 buddies were dressed, washed, and doing their schoolwork and everything else, trying not to think too much about finding Mr. Right wasn't too hard. Besides, Pops was already helping do some of that thinking for me. By the time we wrapped filming for season 6, the show had gotten so popular that my parents were continually receiving requests for speaking engagements, meetings, and interviews. All of that attention led to Pop's opinion and advice being valued and sought after by lots of people. The fact that y'all are seeking this man who's on TV, who doesn't really have a background in it, who isn't a therapist, who isn't a counselor, who isn't an educator, who doesn't have any type of licensing or anything, and y'all are going with this, you got to watch who you allow to give you advice. Protect your mind, people, and your heart. Sometimes the calls were private, but there were times when he might invite a few of us kids to join him as he put the caller on speakerphone so we could listen in and hear him give an update in their ministry. One morning, before the film crew arrived, I was in the girls' bedroom getting ready with a few of my sisters when Pops wandered midway through a call. He muted it and quickly said, "There's a young man I've been talking to. His name is Derek, and he's serving missions in Nepal. Why don't y'all listen in for a while?" I listened for a bit with my sisters, but I didn't want to seem too interested. Plus, I had errands to run, so I didn't pay too much attention. The same thing happened about a month later with Pops coming into the room that I was in and announcing that he was on a call with a missionary guy again. And again, we listened to the conversation on speakerphone, but didn't say anything. This time, after Pops got off the phone, he mentioned that Derek had a blog that we should look at sometime. Something about the way Pops looked right at me as he spoke told me that he had an agenda here. Thinking maybe Pops was trying to set me up, I naturally avoided showing any deep interest. On one hand, I was 21 years old and had no desire to have my dad set me up with some random guy. In my opinion, that would be embarrassing and weird. Then again, I respected Pops, and there was just a small part of me that thought it was kind of sweet that he was looking out for me like this. So I decided to play along, listening carefully to what this missionary in Nepal guy had to say, but not giving Pops any reason to suspect that I was interested. Derek's life was different from mine. He was around my age, just a couple of years older than me, and he came from the same corner of Arkansas. But while my days were filled with siblings and chores and TV crews, he had already graduated college and was out in Nepal serving on a missions field. As he described some of the things he'd been doing since he and Pops last spoke, visiting remote Himalayan villages, building relationships with people who had probably never heard the gospel before, it sounded adventurous and exciting, especially as I've been dreaming of going overseas and working full-time in missions work ever since my first out-country short-term mission trip to the Central America. I wasn't about to get carried away, though. When I next had some free time, I did a little research of my own, finding Derek's blog and Facebook page. There were a lot of nice photos and updates about the work he was doing, and he seemed like a decent guy, but I wasn't interested. I was too busy and focused on midwife schooling and clinicals, writing my book with my sisters, filming, and all the usual chores at home. My schedule was full. The more Pops got to know Derek, though, the more he liked him and the more eager he became, especially because we both had the calling to serve in full-time international ministries. Pop started talking to me specifically about Derek, even suggesting that he might go visit him one day soon. I didn't give it much thought, but my immediate reaction wasn't great. It just seemed a little awkward, I said. "I don't even know the guy." "Come on, Jill," he said. "It'd be great." The network's talking about filming us on vacation to Japan and China. When we were done, we could easily go visit him in Nepal before we fly home. The trip was big news, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for sure. Even though we'd just been on a trip with the Phil Group 2 years before to Europe, I still wasn't used to this level of perks. I was still determined not to lose my head. So I played it cool and told Pops I checked to see if travel plans will work with my midwife studies. It turned out they didn't. So while the plans for the Japan and China trip went ahead, there was no chance of Nepal swing. Pops didn't push too much, but he was patiently persistent, and it wasn't long before another opportunity presented itself. In March of 2013, we were on a road trip, and we were staying with friends in Illinois. When I stepped out from the house to grab something from our bus, Pops was in there alone, phone pressed into his ear, smiling and talking with someone. As soon as he saw me, he motioned me to sit down, flipping the call to speakerphone. It was Derek again, so I figured I knew how this was going to go, with me listening quietly while Derek updated my dad on his work, just like the 3 or 4 times before. This time, however, Pops didn't keep my presence a secret. "Hey, Derek," he said when there was a pause. "I've got my daughter Jill here with me. Why don't you go ahead and tell her a little bit more about yourself and your testimony?" Immediately, my face was burning red. I mouthed, "You didn't tell me you were going to do that. This is so embarrassing." But Pops just smiled and waved me off. I dug him in the ribs with my elbow. Pops' grin just got a little bit bigger. "Hey, Jill," Derek said. Hey." My voice was shaking like never before. "It's nice to meet you." I was relieved when Derek took over the conversation. He told me a little about his upbringing, how he just had one sibling, how when he was a freshman in Oklahoma State, his dad had died suddenly, and how that inspired him to get out and do something significant with his life. He talked about his time in Nepal, about how much he loved the missions field. I didn't say much at all. Even if I had more questions, I didn't want to ask them right at the moment and egg on Pop's excitement. So I just listened, and in a few short minutes, the conversation was over. Derek seemed like a kind person, but I wasn't interested in getting to know him. Instead, I just pushed the awkward telephone conversation out of my mind. At first, way back in the early days when things were just getting going with the show, I was curious about being on TV. I wanted to see what it would be like, to observe what might come through the window of opportunity that God had created for us. As the show gathered momentum, my thoughts became clear. People would often ask me how I felt about it all, typically assuming that I loved it and that being on TV was the coolest thing ever. I'd always answer politely and try not to make anyone feel awkward, but their assumptions were wrong. While it was cool at times and we had some great adventures while filming the TV show, being on TV also had its downsides. As each season was filmed and aired, as more and more of the Duggar family life was transmitted out to the homes across the country, my opinion started to change. The more I experienced what it meant to allow your life to become the focus of a reality TV show, the more I understood that while it was still a ministry for Pops and the rest of us, it was something entirely different for the network that created us. The show, and by extension, the entire Duggar family, was a vehicle for profit. No matter how much Pops talked about flying over NYC and the potential impact of reaching millions with messages of Christ for the company paying bills, we were there to entertain. We had to keep things fresh, and we knew that if we didn't provide the viewers with the content they engage with, there would be no show. If things ever got stale, it would be game over. Keeping things fresh required a lot of planning and sometimes a little rehearsal. A guy asking Pops permission to marry a Duggar girl, or the proposal itself, were some of the best TV moments, but there was practically no room for spontaneity. Each step would be rehearsed in advance, and sometimes keeping things fresh meant bending the rules. So, even though physical contact between courting couples was banned, we'd be allowed to put our arms around each other if the show required it, which is exactly what happened in one episode that featured a weird triple date that involved some extravagant archery contest. What I found the hardest, though, were the ways the show intruded on my most private moments. I was 16 when I had surgery to remove my wisdom teeth, my first ever surgery. I hated needles and was anxious about everything that was involved in the procedure. And knowing that it was going to be the main focus of an episode only made things worse. But saying no to the cameras was not an option. The only comfort I could find was thinking about Mom. I knew she didn't like her birth being filmed, but she went along and did it anyway. If she put up with it, so should I. The longer the show ran, the deeper we had to dig to keep things fresh. Sometimes it was a matter of taking a trip overseas, like a missions trip to El Salvador in seasons 2 and 5, or the epic journey to China and Japan after season 6, or the trips to Israel, Britain, and Ireland. But we didn't have the budget or the time to fill the show with travel alone, and we had to look closer to home for new and exciting content. There's no such thing as bad TV was something the crew said so often that it became a family saying of our own, repeated whenever we encountered a minor crisis like an unplanned trip to the emergency room. Big life events were better, especially major milestones. Mom giving birth would always give our ratings a spike, but it wasn't the only life event that made for great TV. Whenever our producer, Scott, heard that one of us was going to start courting, his eyes would light up like a Christmas tree. Derek and I had started talking regularly after the call on the bus, and the more we talked, the more I liked him. So inevitably, I found myself sitting on the recliner chair in Mom and Pop's bedroom, facing my dad, while I made a phone call to Scott and put him on speaker so we could both hear. I was feeling nervous, even though I knew I had Mom and Pop's full blessing. What I was about to say could not be unsaid. What I was about to do could not be undone. Scott, I have some news to share. Oh, really? Yeah, I have a guy. What? Nice. Who? He sounded excited and genuinely pleased for me. And for a moment, I forgot that this was a business meeting. Yes, Scott, I have a guy, and he's in Nepal. Yes, he said, sounding even more excited than before. Then he kind of laughed as he continued. I don't know anything about this story or anything about this guy, but yes, Nepal's been on my bucket list since forever. When are we going? We all laughed. Yeah, I totally did this for you, Scott. I'd always liked Scott. He made filming fun, and I trusted him too. But I've been doing the show long enough to understand the implications of what we were discussing. Scott, I've never met this guy before. We've only ever spoken on phone or on Skype. Really? Oh, well, that's even better. This is a great story, Jill. I know it is, but I have a question. If we go over there and you film me meeting the guy for the first time, but it doesn't work out and we don't start courting, then do you have to air it? I just don't know how I feel about putting that out there, and I wouldn't want to put this guy out there and through it all either. Scott's tone changed a bit. I see what you're saying, but unfortunately, if we're going to make the investment of taking you, your dad and crew over there and taking all that time out of the regular filming schedule, then we have to air it regardless of how the relationship turns out. I'm sorry. It was exactly the answer I feared. I didn't wrestle with the decision for long. Scott needed an answer quickly, but I did wrestle hard. I liked Derek and had tried to explain what it meant to be in my reality TV family. I hated the thought of things not working out and having to broadcast it all over the world. I could hardly think of anything more humiliating. Then again, this was my only shot of going out there to see him. If I didn't take it, would that window of opportunity for me and Derek ever open again? I talked with Derek about the proposal too, since it would involve the both of us. In the end, the show won. I told Scott that I was willing to go. We found a couple of weeks in late November and made plans. Everything was looking good for a while. Okay, so she's talking here like I had to sit here and I had to give this part of myself. And if it didn't work out, they weren't willing to. And I get where she's going with this. She's going to talk probably about TLC and production and stuff like that, which I'm interested in hearing. But she didn't have to make that choice. They could have spent their own money and done it themselves. Let's keep that in mind. Listen, he said over the phone, when we were a month out from flying to Kathmandu, Kathmandu, we can't do 2 weeks over Thanksgiving. It's got to be 5 days. Excuse me, I said. You go for 5 days if you want, but if I'm going to decide whether it's God is someone I want to spend the rest of my life with, I need 2 weeks. Okay, so I'm going to show the pictures and then I'm going to read. This is them on a motorcycle. Then Derek asking Jill on their official courtship, and then them after the film crew left. So that's him asking on their official courtship. And then that's them. Oh, I put that close. Sorry, y'all. After the film crew left. Okay. I'll do whatever you want. We can film a pretend goodbye scene and I'll return. And no, we can film a pretend goodbye scene and I'll turn on the tears for you. But I'm not doing this in 5 days. I just can't. That time I won. Good job. The crew filmed Pops and I during our 2 days of travel from Northwest Arkansas to Nepal, as well as mine and Derek's first meeting. A moment that I wish I could have been with just me and him in private. They then stayed another 5 days filming various things around Kathmandu, I think it is. I told y'all how it's spelled. I know I'm saying it wrong. Just before we faked our goodbyes for the show, Derek asked me on camera if I would be willing to start an official courtship. My yes was 100% straight from the heart. So even though they faked that part, she really wanted it. I was thankful for the extra week we got to spend together without the film crew. We were able to get to know each other better, and over the days there were little snatch moments when Pops gave us space and our feelings grew. Like the evening when Pops was chaperoning us in the room that he and I were sharing, but he ended up falling asleep. Derek and I sat on the end of the bed eating hot chicken fried rice out of a makeshift tinfoil bowls that Derek had grabbed from a street vendor. That's cute. We talked about everything and nothing, and when it was time to go, Derek looked at me. Good night, he said. I love you. Good night, I said. I love you too. Ooh, they moved quick. I fell deeply in love with Derek. He was polite and respectful, and I could see that Pops was genuinely impressed with him. So when it was really time to go, I was so sad to leave. I cried on his shoulder when I said goodbye in the car at the airport, and then I cried a few more times on the long trip home. The good news was that Derek's 2-year term on the mission field was almost up, so a couple months later, he returned to Arkansas. He was gracious when his closest friends were forced to wait downstairs at the airport so the crew could film my family welcoming him by himself first. I wasn't surprised that the rest of the Duggar family soon got to know and love him too. He impressed my parents by quickly landing a full-time job doing tax accounting at Walmart HQ, as well as enrolling in seminary class. And everybody who met him told me how kind and genuine he was. Every time I heard those words, I could feel myself sighing with relief. I found a guy who I was in love with, who my parents approved of, and who wasn't going to cause tension within the family or have a problem with filming. Derek was unique, and there was no way I was letting him go. Derek came back to the U.S. January 2014, but by the end of February, we were already talking about getting married. At the end of March, Derek proposed, successfully working with Scott and the crew to deliver all the ingredients of a great episode, and we started planning our June wedding. It was Easter Sunday when Derek called and told me that his mom had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's stage 4, he said. Goodness. Okay, let me focus. The first doctor she saw wasn't even willing to treat her and told her there was nothing that they could do at this point. She found another doctor who gave her a second opinion, and he was going to start intensive chemo next week, but they haven't given her much hope. I was in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 4 hours away, chaperoning Jessa as she spent time with the guy she was courting. I felt the earth shattering all around me. Let me show you this picture before I continue. That's them when he first came back to the U.S. Derek's mom and I had become very close friends over the last several months, and she told me how excited she was to finally be getting a daughter. I couldn't imagine what Derek was going through, having already lost his dad and now being told that his mom was going to likely die too. He'd be left with just one sibling, and I couldn't ever begin to comprehend what that must have felt like. Whenever I tried to put myself in that position, the feeling of loneliness was so terrifying that it made it hard to breathe. But Derek was not like me. As the days and weeks rolled by, I was witnessing the strength of his character, the depth of his faith, and the power of the bonds of love that he held his family together. He continued to work to check in on his mom and help her where needed, supporting his wonderful stepdad, Ronnie, who was caring for her 24/7. Derek continued to attend seminary. That would not come out. Plan the wedding, and still make himself available for filming. His determination and capacity for hard work was awe-inspiring, and the more I got to know his mom, Kathy, the more it made sense. She received her cancer diagnosis with courage and the kind of wholehearted trust in God that takes lifetimes to mature. She refused to give in to fear and told everyone who asked how she was feeling that she was convinced she was going to survive. Kathy's diagnosis meant the wedding was even more significant on a personal level. For a while, at least, the fact that the day would be filmed and broadcast took a back seat. That didn't last long. I was the first Duggar daughter to get married, and the network was determined to get as much great TV out of it as possible. As the big day got closer, more and more of the decisions were made with the show in mind. Most of the time, I was okay with it. I didn't mind that the guest list had grown to 2,000. What? To 2,000? Or that some of them were complete strangers to me. I didn't care. I was focused on getting through the wedding planning details and marrying my best friend. But when it came to photos, we had a problem. I wanted all the guests to be able to take photos and then share them on an app with special tags so I could have copies of all their pictures. The network did not agree. They wanted exclusive rights, said Pops, and they're worried that if we let people take photos, they'll leak. They're offering to pay for photographers. I was tired and stressed for a while. I tried to dig in and hold my ground in the sweetest and most polite way possible, but my holding out didn't last. The pressure mounted. That's sad that she couldn't have that. This is them again. That's sad. And this is them doing interviews at the shop. I guess we'll hear about the shop. I hope my battery lasts. This is not a hill to die on, said Derek after the subject had come up at the wedding planning meeting we had with my dad and another representative from the network. We can let this one go. Reluctantly, I agreed with him. The whole month leading up to the wedding was a blur, but I was still aware that some changes were happening. There was talk of a new season of the show being agreed on. Also, Pops hired somebody to work with him from the first time ever, which struck me as notably different but good. It's interesting that she had to make all these sacrifices for her wedding and she didn't even get any money from this. Her dad did. The show had grown in popularity and my parents were both getting pretty overwhelmed by things. Pops had always kept things to himself, but there had been times when I'd wonder whether it was all starting to get a little too much for him. So it makes sense for them to get some help. Bringing this new guy, Chad, to help with public relations and any negotiations or business deals could only be a good thing. Then there was the plane. The higher our viewer numbers had climbed, the more time Mom and Pops had been spending traveling to different speaking engagements. It had started to get a little too much for them, so Pops bought a 4-seater single-engine plane and arranged for a local pilot friend to fly them when they needed to travel. Being Pops and knowing my brother John's childhood dream to become a pilot, he also arranged for his friend to give John flight lessons, so John often accompanied them on flights to gain training hours. So he spent money to buy a plane and did all these other things. Also, none of that money went to the kids. I was happy for my parents and John, and though I thought about it briefly, I didn't want to ask how much the plane had cost or where the money had come from. Exactly. And then 8 days before the wedding, at our final planning meeting, Derek received a call. We were at a local restaurant. Derek and I, Mom, Pops, Jenna, all 3 of my wedding coordinator friends. Derek and I had just come from seeing his mom at the hospital, but before we could even start the meeting, Derek's phone rang and he stepped away from the table. He didn't say much on the call, just a few basic questions. I watched the blood drain from his face. When it was finished, he pocketed his phone, walked back and looked at everyone. I'm sorry, I think I've got to go. My mom's gotten worse. She's being life flighted by a helicopter to a new hospital. She's not doing well. It sounds pretty serious. In that moment, everything changed. For weeks, my phone had been constantly announcing some new message to respond to, a missed call to return, or some vital decision that was long overdue. I no longer had the capacity to deal with it. If it hadn't been for my sister offering to take my phone and handling all of the wedding stuff for me in the final days, I'd have spun out completely. I spent those days leading up to the wedding visiting the hospital as much as possible. Whenever we were not there, I fully expected Derek to receive another call at any moment telling him to get back and be with his mom before she passed. I braced for impact. My insides clenched, my heart just moments away from breaking, but the call never came. Oh, yeah. The day before our wedding, We started to hope that Derek's mom might actually make it. She was even talking about joining us at the church. I don't remember what happened here because it was so long ago. That's his mom. In June 2014, and his brother. Mom says she's going to be there, said Derek. I don't know how, but they're saying they'll let her sign a release and let her out of the hospital on oxygen to be there. It was the best news ever, and I hoped and prayed she'd be able to make it. The day was a blur with the big house full of people, and the levels of noise and chaos, laughter higher than ever. After I ran by the hospital to check on Kathy, I rushed back home to move some of my things out, then got ready for the filmed wedding rehearsal, run through at the church, and that afternoon, followed by the rehearsal dinner that evening. My brothers were excited to be heading out with Derek to his bachelor party after the dinner that evening, and my older sisters and I were like a bunch of giggling preteens once again, as we were going to stay at a hotel for some extra sister time away from the chaos. Overall, it was a good day, but one memory stands out more in hindsight than others. Hey, said Pops to some of the older siblings earlier in the day. Chad and I have been finalizing stuff on the new show, and I have some papers for y'all to sign here. Can y'all do it real quick before you leave? So they didn't even read it. Sure, I said, not thinking much about it. Some of the big TLC and production people who weren't usually around were coming to town, so I imagine Pops was feeling more pressure than normal to get everything they needed together. What's this for? Oh, it's just about how you're going to get paid. I looked at the papers sitting on the dining room table. Single sheets with signature lines, each of our names printed. A few had already been signed. I didn't see any extra papers to read, and I didn't really know what it was about, but I didn't question my dad. After all, in all my life, I never had a reason not to trust Pops. He knew best and always had, so I picked up the pen and signed. That is the end of this chapter, and I'm so happy that the camera cooperated and I had enough memory to complete it. Y'all, what do we think of this chapter? Because there's a lot of things that were put in here. You all tell me, do you guys think that she made the right decision to bring TLC to her first meeting? That's my first question. My second question is, what do y'all think was up with those papers that they were all asked to sign? If you have not done so already, please like the video. If you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting on? I'm on the road to 2,000. Yes, I know I was just asking for 1,000, but why stop there? I appreciate you for your time. Until next time.